The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace gates as Royal Guard Marcus Thompson adjusted his uniform for the third time that hour. 23 years of service had taught him to trust his instincts, and today something felt different. The usual flow of tourists and delivery vehicles seemed normal enough, but there was an electricity in the air that made his hand rest unconsciously on his radio. Marcus had seen it all during his decades protecting the royal family. Protesters with painted signs, overzealous fans trying to climb the gates, and the occasional genuine security threat that required swift action. His weathered face bore the marks of a man who had learned to read people and situations with surgical precision. Today was supposed to be routine, a quiet Tuesday morning with minimal scheduled activities. The white delivery van approached the checkpoint at exactly 9:47 a.m. Marcus noted the time automatically, as he did with every vehicle. The van appeared unremarkable at first glance. Standard commercial model, properly painted company logos, and the correct documentation displayed on the dashboard. The driver wore the uniform of a legitimate catering company that regularly serviced palace events. But something was wrong. Marcus felt it in his bones before his mind could process the details. The driver's hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly. His eyes darted nervously between Marcus and the rearview mirror. Most telling of all, there was a thin line of sweat on the man's forehead despite the cool morning air. Marcus stepped forward with practiced authority, his boots clicking against the asphalt. The protocol was simple and routine. Check identification, verify the delivery schedule, and conduct a basic inspection of the cargo area. He had performed this same procedure thousands of times without incident. The driver rolled down his window and handed over his credentials with shaking hands. Marcus examined the paperwork carefully, noting that everything appeared to be in order. The delivery was scheduled, the signatures were correct, and the company had cleared their usual security checks just yesterday. Yet his instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. The driver's nervous energy was palpable, and Marcus caught him glancing repeatedly toward the back of the van. When asked routine questions about the delivery contents, the man's answers came too quickly, as if rehearsed. Marcus made his decision. Instead of waving the van through as he might have done on any other morning, he stepped around to the rear of the vehicle. The driver's protest was immediate and suspicious, claiming he was running late for an important delivery that couldn't be delayed. The guard's training kicked in as he approached the van's rear doors. His hand moved instinctively to his radio to alert the control room, but he wanted to assess the situation first. The exterior of the cargo area showed no obvious signs of tampering, but there were scratches around the lock that looked fresh. As Marcus reached for the door handle, he heard something that made his blood run cold. It was faint, almost imperceptible over the rumble of the van's engine, but unmistakable once he focused on it. The sound was coming from inside the cargo area, and it was definitely human. Someone was in the back of that van and they were trying to make noise. The sound pattern was deliberate, not the random movement of shifting cargo, but the rhythmic tapping of someone attempting to communicate. Marcus had heard similar sounds during his military service, when captured soldiers used coded tapping to signal their presence. The driver had gone completely silent now, no longer making excuses or protests. Marcus could see him in the side mirror, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The man's earlier nervousness had transformed into something much more dangerous. The tense alertness of someone preparing to make a desperate move. Marcus's years of experience told him he was standing at the edge of a situation that could explode into violence at any moment. The tapping from inside the van continued, growing more urgent. Someone back there needed help, and they needed it now. Every second of delay could mean the difference between a successful rescue and a tragedy. Without hesitation, Marcus gripped the van's rear door handle and prepared to discover what lay hidden in the darkness beyond. The doors swung open with a metallic creak that seemed to echo through the morning air. Marcus had prepared himself for many possibilities, but nothing could have readied him for what he found inside the dimly lit cargo area. Huddled in the far corner, bound with rope and gagged with torn fabric, was a young girl who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. Her wide, terrified eyes met his through tangled blonde hair, and Marcus felt his professional composure crack for just a moment. The child's clothes were dirty and torn, suggesting she had been held captive for some time. Fresh bruises marked her wrists where the ropes had cut into her skin, and her face was streaked with tears and dirt. The girl's eyes weren't just filled with fear. They held a desperate hope that Marcus recognized from his years of service. She had heard his footsteps approaching and had been the source of the tapping sounds. Even in her terrified state, she had possessed the courage and intelligence to try to alert someone to her presence. Marcus's hand moved immediately to his weapon, as the full implications of the situation became clear. This wasn't just a security breach or an unauthorized delivery. This was an act of kidnapping, and the perpetrator was sitting just a few feet away in the driver's seat. The palace had unknowingly become the target location for what appeared to be a ransom attempt or worse. Behind him, Marcus heard the van's engine rev suddenly. The driver had obviously realized that his cargo had been discovered and was preparing to flee. But the security protocols at the palace gates meant that the heavy barriers were still in place, and armed guards controlled every exit point. Marcus shouted into his radio with urgent authority, calling for immediate backup and a complete lockdown of the area. Within seconds, the quiet morning exploded into coordinated action as additional guards emerged from their positions and surrounded the vehicle. The driver found himself trapped between the closed security barriers and a team of highly trained professionals. The girl in the back of the van had started crying again, but these were tears of relief rather than despair. Marcus carefully climbed into the cargo area and began working to free her from her restraints, speaking in calm, reassuring tones despite the chaos erupting around them. As he cut through the ropes binding her wrists, Marcus noticed details that made his anger burn even hotter. The girl was wearing what had once been an expensive school uniform, now dirty and damaged. A small medical bracelet on her wrist identified her as diabetic, and Marcus realized with growing concern that she might need immediate medical attention. The driver had stopped trying to escape, and now sat motionless in the front seat, surrounded by armed guards with their weapons drawn. Through the van's windows, Marcus could see the man's face in the mirror, no longer nervous or desperate, but resigned to the fact that his plan had completely unraveled. Emergency medical personnel arrived within minutes, summoned by Marcus's radio call. As paramedics began examining the girl, she managed to whisper her name, Emma Richardson, and Marcus immediately recognized it from the missing person reports that had been circulating through law enforcement channels. For the past week, Emma Richardson was the daughter of a prominent businessman who had been taken from her private school 7 days earlier. The kidnapping had made national headlines, and her family had been desperately appealing for information about her whereabouts. The fact that she had been brought to the palace, Gates suggested this was meant to be either a high-profile ransom exchange or a symbolic statement of some kind. As the medical team carefully moved Emma to a waiting ambulance, Marcus maintained his position near the van, ensuring that no evidence was disturbed. The driver was being extracted from the vehicle and placed under arrest. But Marcus knew that this man was likely just one piece of a larger criminal operation. The girl's courage in alerting him to her presence had quite possibly saved her life. Marcus realized that if he had simply waved the van through as routine, Emma might have disappeared forever into whatever nightmare her captors had planned for her. The morning that had started so quietly had transformed into one of the most significant rescues of Marcus's career. But even as emergency responders worked to ensure Emma's safety, he couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was far from over. Someone had planned to use the palace as a backdrop for their crime, and Marcus was determined to find out why. Detective Sarah Chen arrived at the palace gates 30 minutes after Marcus's emergency call, bringing with her a team of forensic specialists and investigators who immediately began processing the scene. As the lead detective on Emma Richardson's kidnapping case, she had been working around the clock for a week, following dead-end leads and false sightings that had led nowhere. The driver, now identified as Thomas Brennan, sat in the back of a police vehicle with his hands cuffed behind him. His criminal record showed a history of petty theft and fraud, but nothing that suggested he was capable of masterminding a sophisticated kidnapping operation. Detective Chen suspected he was merely a hired accomplice, paid to transport Emma to what was supposed to be the final phase of the crime. Marcus briefed Detective Chen on every detail he could remember, from the moment the van approached the checkpoint. His trained observation skills had captured crucial information: the driver's nervous behavior, the suspicious scratches around the cargo door locks, and most importantly, His decision to trust his instincts rather than follow routine protocol. Emma had been transported to the hospital for medical evaluation, but not before providing police with the first solid leads they had received since her disappearance. Through her tears and trauma, she managed to describe being held in a basement somewhere in the city, watched over by at least 2 other men who spoke with foreign accents. She remembered being moved multiple times, always blindfolded, before ending up in the van. The forensic team's initial examination of the vehicle revealed disturbing evidence of Emma's ordeal. Traces of sedatives were found on fabric samples, suggesting she had been drugged to keep her quiet during transport. The van's GPS system provided a detailed record of its movements over the past week, giving investigators a roadmap of locations connected to the kidnapping. Detective Chen's phone rang as she supervised the evidence collection. The caller was Emma's father, businessman Robert Richardson, who had been desperately waiting for any news about his daughter. The relief in his voice when Chen told him Emma had been found alive was overwhelming, but it quickly turned to anger when he learned about the circumstances of her rescue. Richardson revealed information that added a new dimension to the case. His company had been involved in sensitive negotiations over a major government contract worth millions of dollars. 3 weeks before Emma's kidnapping, he had received anonymous threats warning him to withdraw his bid or face consequences. He had reported the threats to police, but never imagined they would target his daughter. This revelation transformed the investigation from a simple kidnapping for ransom into something much more complex: corporate espionage with violent criminal methods. Someone had decided that terrorizing a businessman's family was an acceptable way to influence a government contract, and they had nearly succeeded. Marcus remained at the scene as investigators pieced together the timeline of events. The van had been stolen 3 days earlier from a legitimate catering company, and fake documentation had been prepared to get it through palace security. The plan appeared to be bringing Emma to the palace gates, where her presence would create maximum media attention and pressure on her father. The driver, Thomas Brennan, finally began talking under interrogation. He claimed he had been hired through intermediaries and never met the people ultimately responsible for the kidnapping. His job was simply to transport the girl to the palace and wait for further instructions. He insisted he didn't know what the final plan was supposed to be, but investigators found inconsistencies in Brennan's story that suggested he knew more than he was admitting. Cell phone records showed multiple calls to numbers registered to false identities, and financial records revealed recent cash deposits that far exceeded his legitimate income. Someone had paid him well for his role in the operation. Detective Chen realized they were dealing with a criminal organization sophisticated enough to research government security protocols, forge official documents, and coordinate a complex kidnapping operation. The fact that they had chosen the palace as their target location suggested they understood the symbolic impact it would create. As the afternoon wore on, additional evidence began painting a picture of a crime that extended far beyond Emma's kidnapping. The GPS data from the van led investigators to several locations around the city where other suspicious activities had been reported in recent weeks. They were uncovering what appeared to be a network of criminal activities designed to influence business and government decisions through intimidation. Emma's rescue had been just the beginning. The real work of dismantling the organization responsible for her kidnapping was only starting, and Marcus's split-second decision to trust his instincts had prevented what could have been a much larger and more devastating crime. The investigation expanded rapidly as Detective Chen's team followed the digital trail left by Emma's kidnappers. The GPS coordinates from the van led them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where forensic evidence confirmed Emma had been held for several days. The basement she had described was found exactly as she remembered it: oboe, makeshift prison cell with chains bolted to the concrete walls and evidence of multiple occupants over time. Marcus found himself called in as a key witness, his detailed observations becoming crucial pieces of the prosecution's case. During his formal statement, he described the moment he realized something was wrong with the van's driver, emphasizing how years of security training had taught him to recognize the subtle signs of deception and danger. Emma's medical evaluation revealed the full extent of her ordeal. Beyond the physical injuries from her restraints, she showed signs of psychological trauma that would require months of counseling to overcome. However, Her doctors were amazed by her resilience and determination. Even while imprisoned, she had remained alert and observant, gathering information that would prove invaluable to the investigation. The warehouse discovery led to the arrest of 3 additional suspects, all with connections to international criminal organizations. Phone records and financial transactions revealed a sophisticated network that had been operating for years, using kidnapping and intimidation to influence business deals worth millions of dollars. Emma's case was just the latest in a series of similar crimes across multiple countries. Detective Chen learned that Robert Richardson's company wasn't the only target. At least 6 other businesses involved in government contracts had received similar threats over the past year. Several had quietly withdrawn their bids rather than risk their families' safety, unaware that doing so had funded and encouraged the criminal organization to continue their operations. The international scope of the investigation brought in federal agents and Interpol, representatives who had been tracking the same criminal network for years. Emma's rescue had provided the breakthrough they needed to identify key members of the organization and understand their methods of operation. Marcus received commendation from his superiors for his actions, but he remained focused on the larger implications of what had happened. The fact that criminals had been able to get so close to the palace raised serious questions about security protocols and the need for enhanced training for all guard personnel. During one of his interviews with investigators, Marcus revealed that he had noticed unusual activity around the palace grounds in the weeks leading up to Emma's rescue. Vehicles had been observed conducting surveillance, photographing guard positions and timing shift changes. What he had initially dismissed as tourist curiosity now appeared to be reconnaissance for the kidnapping operation. Emma's testimony, given through child psychologists trained to work with trauma victims, provided a detailed picture of her captor's organization. She had overheard conversations in multiple languages and remembered specific details about the vehicles used to transport her. Her descriptions helped investigators identify additional suspects and understand the hierarchy of the criminal network. The technological evidence was equally revealing. The kidnappers had used sophisticated communication methods to coordinate their activities, but they had made crucial mistakes that left digital fingerprints. Their attempts to use Emma's presence at the palace to create media pressure on her father had required extensive planning and communication that investigators were able to trace. Robert Richardson worked closely with law enforcement to understand how his business activities had made his family a target. The government contract his company had been pursuing involved sensitive technology with potential military applications, making it attractive to foreign interests willing to use criminal methods to gain access. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Emma's rescue had disrupted a much larger criminal enterprise. The organization had been planning similar operations against other business leaders and government officials, using their families as leverage to influence decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Marcus's role in stopping this operation extended far beyond rescuing one kidnapped child. His decision to trust his instincts and investigate the suspicious van had prevented what could have been an ongoing campaign of terror against business and government leaders. The evidence gathered from Emma's case was being used to protect other potential victims and dismantle an international criminal network. The media attention surrounding Emma's rescue brought public awareness to the growing threat of criminal organizations targeting business families. Security experts began recommending enhanced protection measures for executives involved in sensitive government contracts, and law enforcement agencies increased their focus on preventing similar crimes. 3 months after Emma's rescue, the investigation had grown into one of the largest international criminal cases in recent history. The network that had kidnapped her was found to have connections spanning across 12 countries, with operations involving everything from corporate espionage to human trafficking. Marcus found himself testifying before a grand jury, his detailed account of that morning at the palace gate serving as the foundation for charges against dozens of suspects. Emma had returned to school, though she now traveled with security protection and received ongoing counseling to help process her traumatic experience. Her courage during captivity and her detailed memory of events had made her an invaluable witness, but investigators were careful to minimize her direct involvement in the legal proceedings to protect her recovery. The warehouse, where Emma had been held, yielded evidence of at least 15 other kidnapping victims over the past 3 years. Most had been released after their families complied with the criminals' demands, but investigators found disturbing evidence suggesting that not all victims had survived their ordeals. Marcus's intervention had likely saved Emma from becoming another tragic statistic. Detective Chen had been promoted to lead a new task force specifically focused on crimes targeting business executives and government officials. Her work on Emma's case had revealed patterns of criminal activity that law enforcement agencies had previously failed to connect. The database she developed was being used internationally to identify and prevent similar crimes. The trial of Thomas Brennan, the van driver, provided additional insights into how the criminal organization recruited and managed their operatives. Brennan revealed that he had been approached through legitimate employment channels, initially hired for what he believed were legal transportation services. Only gradually had he been drawn into increasingly criminal activities, with threats against his own family ensuring his continued cooperation. Marcus had undergone extensive debriefing sessions with security experts who were using his experience to improve training protocols for guards and law enforcement personnel worldwide. His ability to recognize subtle behavioral cues and trust his instincts was being taught as a model for effective security work. The palace security system had been completely overhauled following the incident. New protocols required more extensive background checks for delivery personnel, enhanced surveillance of approaching vehicles, and improved communication systems between guards and control rooms. Marcus had been promoted to head of training for new security personnel, sharing his decades of experience with the next generation of palace guards. Robert Richardson's company had ultimately won the government contract they had been pursuing, but Richardson had donated the profits to organizations working to combat human trafficking and support kidnapping victims. His experience with Emma's kidnapping had transformed him from a focused businessman into an advocate for improved protection of executives' families. The international implications of the case had led to new cooperation agreements between law enforcement agencies in multiple countries. The criminal network's sophisticated use of technology and their ability to operate across borders had exposed weaknesses in international crime-fighting efforts that were now being addressed through enhanced information sharing and coordinated investigations. Emma's psychiatrist reported that while she continued to struggle with the trauma of her experience, she had shown remarkable resilience and determination to recover. She had expressed interest in eventually working in law enforcement herself, inspired by the people who had worked to rescue her and bring her captors to justice. The media coverage of Emma's case had brought international attention to the growing threat of criminal organizations targeting business families. Security companies reported increased demand for executive protection services, and many corporations had implemented new safety protocols for their leadership, teams, and their families. Marcus often reflected on how a single moment of trusting his instincts had led to such far-reaching consequences. His decision to investigate the suspicious van had not only saved Emma's life, but had also exposed and disrupted a criminal network that had been operating with impunity for years. The investigation had revealed that the criminals had been planning to use Emma's presence at the palace to create a media spectacle that would pressure her father into withdrawing from the government contract competition. They had calculated that the symbolic significance of the palace location would generate maximum publicity and demonstrate their ability to strike at even the most secure locations. As the legal proceedings continued, Marcus maintained his regular duties at the palace while also serving as a consultant on security matters for other government facilities. His experience had made him a recognized expert on threat assessment and the importance of trusting professional instincts in security situations. 1 year after Emma's rescue, the final trials of the criminal network members reached their conclusion. The evidence gathered from that single van at the palace gates had led to convictions in 12 countries, with sentences ranging from 20 years to life imprisonment. The organization that had terrorized business families across multiple continents had been completely dismantled, their financial assets seized and distributed to victim compensation funds. Marcus had become something of a legend within law enforcement circles, though he remained characteristically modest about his role in the investigation. He continued his duties at the palace while also traveling internationally to train security personnel and law enforcement officers in threat recognition and assessment techniques. His story was being taught in police academies and security training programs around the world. Emma, now 13, had made a remarkable recovery from her traumatic experience. She had returned to her normal school activities and was excelling in her studies, particularly in subjects related to law and criminal justice. Her parents reported that while she still occasionally had nightmares about her captivity, she had regained her confidence and sense of security. The Richardson family had established a foundation dedicated to supporting kidnapping victims and their families, as well as funding research into preventing similar crimes. Emma had become a young advocate for the foundation's work, speaking at carefully managed public events about the importance of never giving up hope and the courage required to survive traumatic experiences. Detective Chen's task force had become a permanent international organization, with representatives from law enforcement agencies in 30 countries working together to identify and prevent crimes, targeting business executives and government officials. The database and protocols developed from Emma's case had already prevented dozens of similar kidnapping attempts. The warehouse where Emma had been held had been converted into a training facility for law enforcement personnel, with realistic scenarios designed to help officers understand the psychology and methods of international criminal organizations. Marcus served as a regular instructor at the facility, sharing his insights about reading situations and trusting professional instincts. The palace security protocols developed after Emma's rescue had become a model for government facilities worldwide. The enhanced screening procedures and improved communication systems had been implemented at sensitive locations across multiple countries, significantly improving their ability to detect and prevent security threats. Robert Richardson had testified before international business organizations about the importance of understanding security threats and protecting executive families. His company had become a leader in developing security technologies and protocols for businesses operating in sensitive industries. The technological evidence gathered from the criminal network had revealed sophisticated methods for conducting surveillance and planning operations that law enforcement agencies had not previously encountered. This intelligence was being used to develop new counter-surveillance techniques and improve the security of potential targets. Marcus's personnel file now included commendations from law enforcement agencies in 8 countries, as well as recognition from international security organizations. However, he took the most pride in the letters he received from other security personnel who had successfully applied his training to prevent crimes and protect innocent people. The legal proceedings had revealed that the criminal network had been planning to expand their operations to include political figures and their families, using kidnapping and intimidation to influence government policies and international relations. Emma's rescue had prevented what could have become a significant threat to democratic institutions. Emma's medical team reported that her recovery had been accelerated by her active involvement in helping other kidnapping victims and their families. Her ability to turn her traumatic experience into a force for helping others had played a crucial
role in her psychological healing. The
international cooperation sparked by Emma's case had led to significant improvements in how law enforcement agencies share information and coordinate investigations across borders. The protocols developed for tracking international criminal networks were being applied to other types of crimes, including terrorism and financial fraud. Marcus had been offered positions with several international security organizations, but he chose to remain at the palace where his career had started. He felt that his experience could best serve others by continuing to train the next generation of security personnel while maintaining his vigilant watch over one of the world's most important locations. The anniversary of Emma's rescue was marked by a private ceremony at the palace, attended by the key figures who had worked to save her and dismantle the criminal network. Emma, now a confident young woman, presented Marcus with a handwritten letter thanking him for trusting his instincts and refusing to let evil triumph over innocence. 5 years had passed since that transformative morning at the palace gates, and the ripple effects of Marcus's split-second decision continued to spread across the globe. The International Security Training Institute, established using funds seized from the criminal network, had graduated over 3,000 security personnel who carried Marcus's teachings about instinct and observation to protective details around the world. Emma Richardson, now 18, had been accepted to study criminology at university with plans to join law enforcement after graduation. Her childhood trauma had been transformed into a powerful motivation to protect others from similar experiences. She maintained regular correspondence with Marcus, whom she credited with not only saving her life but inspiring her career choice. Marcus, now 51, had been appointed as the Director of International Security Protocols, a position that allowed him to influence security standards at government facilities across multiple continents. His training programs had become mandatory for palace guards, embassy security personnel, and executive protection teams worldwide. The foundation established by the Richardson family had grown into a major force in combating human trafficking and supporting victims of kidnapping. Emma served on its board of directors while completing her studies, bringing a unique perspective as someone who had experienced both the horror of captivity and the hope of rescue. Detective Chen, now heading an international task force based in Brussels, had overseen the prevention of over 200 kidnapping attempts using the database and protocols developed from Emma's case. The network of criminal organizations that had once operated with impunity across borders now found themselves constantly monitored and disrupted by coordinated international law enforcement efforts. The palace where Marcus continued his daily duties had become a pilgrimage site for security professionals from around the world who came to study the location where one guard's instincts had prevented an international catastrophe. The exact spot where Marcus had first sensed something wrong with the delivery van was marked with a small plaque recognizing the importance of trusting professional judgment. Robert Richardson's company had become a leader in developing security technologies, with many of their innovations directly inspired by the lessons learned from Emma's kidnapping. Their employee protection programs were considered the gold standard for businesses operating in sensitive industries. The warehouse that had once held Emma captive was now the centerpiece of the law enforcement training complex, where thousands of officers each year learned about criminal psychology, victim psychology, and the importance of thorough investigations. Marcus conducted quarterly seminars there, always emphasizing that successful security work required both professional training and the courage to act on instinct. Emma's story had been documented in a book written by Detective Chen, with all proceeds going to victim support organizations. The book had become required reading in law enforcement academies worldwide, illustrating how a single criminal case could expose and dismantle an entire international network. The security protocols developed after Emma's rescue had prevented numerous attempted attacks on government facilities, business leaders, and their families. Marcus's emphasis on behavioral observation and trusting trained instincts had become fundamental principles taught to security personnel around the globe. On the 5th anniversary of Emma's rescue, a special ceremony was held at the palace to recognize all those who had contributed to dismantling the criminal network. Emma, now a confident young woman preparing for her own career in law enforcement, delivered a speech about the importance of never underestimating the power of one person choosing to do the right thing at the right moment. Marcus, standing in the same spot where he had first approached the suspicious van, reflected on how dramatically that single morning had changed not only Emma's life but his own. His decision to trust his instincts rather than follow routine procedure had evolved into a career dedicated to teaching others the same principle. The international criminal network that had once terrorized business families across continents was now studied in criminology courses as an example of how sophisticated criminal organizations could be dismantled through coordinated law enforcement efforts and the courage of individuals willing to take action when they sensed danger. Emma's recovery and transformation into an advocate for other victims had become a symbol of resilience and hope for families affected by similar crimes. Her foundation continued to grow, supporting not only kidnapping victims but also funding research into preventing such crimes and improving law enforcement response. As Marcus completed his shift that anniversary evening, he paused at the palace gates where everything had begun. The morning routine that had seemed so ordinary 5 years ago had taught him that the most important moments in life often arrived without warning. Disguised as routine decisions that would prove to have extraordinary consequences, the young girl who had once tapped desperately on the walls of a van's cargo area was now preparing to spend her life ensuring that other victims would never have to endure what she had experienced, and the guard who had trusted his instincts had become a teacher whose lessons would protect countless innocent people for generations to come.